welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 27, The Rise and Fall of Global Communism. So, like I kept mentioning in last week's podcast, communism had a major impact on the 20th century. In the 20th century, communist governments come to power all over the world. They radically transform societies, and communism creates this global rivalry against capitalism. So global communism or world communism is this massive thing in the 20th century, and then towards the end of the 20th century, it just sort of dies out. So in this podcast, I want to look at exactly what is this idea of communism, look at what the appeal of communism is, and where communist governments take shape. Look a little bit at what communism looked like in practice, specifically in the Soviet Union and China, and then look at how communism died out towards the end of the 20th century. So, what is communism? We talked a little bit about communism in Unit 4, the 19th century, and communism has its roots in the 19th century. It has its roots in the political philosophy of Karl Marx. At the most basic level, the idea of communism is that there should be no inequality in a society. Everybody should be equal. Marxist theory is more complicated than this, but that's at the most basic level, that's what we need to know. To Karl Marx, the main driving force in all history was class conflict. Inequality between social classes is the primary force behind all social change. And since really the beginning of settled agricultural communities, this process has been at work. History was evolving and developing. Marx was writing in the context of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, and this was a time of extreme social inequality. The class conflict at this time was between what he saw as the bourgeoisie, who were rich business elite, factory owners, corporations, and the proletariat, who are the working masses. And this, of course, is the system of industrial capitalism. Before the system of industrial capitalism, feudalism ruled. And in this system, landlords exploited the peasants. There's class conflict in feudalism, and it led to the overthrow of the system. The most recent example for Marx was the French Revolution. But as Marx saw, the French Revolution and the emergence of more democratic governments really benefited businesses more than the working masses. It did lead to industrialization, and this is very important. Industrialization was a necessary bridge between feudalism and communism. There were tons of problems with capitalism, but Marx saw capitalism and industrialization as a necessary step between an agricultural economy and a communist society. It was a natural evolution. And of course, communism ends up arising in countries that never went through an industrialization phase. So none of the countries that became communist in the 20th century were good candidates for becoming communist countries. Ultimately, what Marx saw communism as was the final stage of historical development, and this final stage could only happen after industrialization. Ideally, through communism, everybody would be totally equal, people would live collectively, there would be no private property. So, Marx was writing about communism in Great Britain, why it would be great, but it ends up catching on in many more places. So the primary focus of this podcast isn't going to be on Marxist economic theory, but instead, where did communism take root? What happened when it took root? And when did it fall apart? Most of the podcast will focus on communist experiments in the Soviet Union and China. Communism in both of these countries came about after revolutions, and both of these revolutions were similar to the French Revolution in that they sought to get rid of the ruling class. With the French Revolution, this ruling class was the monarchy and the aristocracy. Like the French Revolution, the Russian and Chinese revolutions eliminated the existing ruling classes and took land from landlords. All three revolutions, the French, the Russian, and the Chinese, involved peasant uprisings in the countryside. All three revolutions were led by educated people from the cities. And there's some even more connections. all three revolutions were about constructing a brand new society. So we've seen this in the past, especially in China. Often revolutions or rebellions are made in the name of returning to some supposed earlier golden age. So rebellions, revolutions made with a sense of nostalgia. We're going to go back to a better time. In China, this happened over and over again. But the communist revolutions and the French Revolution weren't about this. They were trying to create something brand new, a society that had never been seen before. There are some differences between the communist revolutions and the French Revolution as well. Most obvious difference is the beliefs of the movements. French Revolution was made in the name of democracy and individual rights, whereas the Russian and Chinese revolutions were made in the name of equality. The French Revolution wanted more economic freedom for the business class. The Russian and Chinese revolutions wanted to get rid of private property. The people that benefited from the French Revolution were middle class, whereas the Russian and Chinese revolutions were made in the name of society's lower classes. So we're going to start by taking a look at the actual revolutions in both Russia and China. The Russian Revolution happened quickly. The entire revolution unfolded in 1917. So what's happening in Russia in 1917? If I hear 1917, the thing that comes to mind is, well, that's during World War I. And that's right, World War I was the immediate cause of the Russian Revolution. Times were extremely hard in Russia during World War I. There were shortages of food, people were starving, soldiers were getting massacred in battles, and people were just generally fed up with the Russian monarchy, and they took to the streets in protest. Soldiers weren't listening to their commanding officers anymore. The feeling of Russian soldiers was basically they were getting marched into battle to die, and there wasn't really any sort of plan for winning the war. They were losing their lives for no reason, and they deserted in mass numbers. Unions overthrew factory owners and took control of the factories. Peasants took control of their landlords' farms. They chased the landlords away, burned their houses to the ground, divided land up between them. The monarchy had lost control of the country, and in this context, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas Romanov II, the Tsar is the leader of the Russian monarchy, had no choice but to step down. He had lost total support of the people and total control of the country. There was a provisional government set up to rule the country after the monarchy left. Provisional government is a government that's in place for a limited set amount of time until something better gets figured out. But the provisional government couldn't calm down the country. Popular sentiment was that Russia needed to get out of the war immediately, and the provisional government wasn't willing to do this. So this opened the door for more radical groups to come in that promised to get Russia out of the war. The group that was most effective in Russia were known as the Bolsheviks. Their leader was Vladimir Ulyanov. And Ulyanov was a political enemy of the Tsar. His brother was as well. When Ulyanov was younger, his brother was assassinated. So he had been involved in some rebellious activity, and he was exiled to Germany. During the First World War, the Germans smuggled Ulyanov back into Russia, hoping that he could stir things up and destabilize the country. So he becomes the leader of the Bolshevik party. He takes on the name Vladimir Lenin, and he leads the Bolsheviks to power in Russia. Now, the Bolsheviks are a communist party. Russia is not an industrialized country at this point, and according to the theories of Karl Marx, the father of communism, you can't have communist revolution in a country that isn't industrialized. You need those industrial capabilities for communism to work properly. But Lenin knew what he wanted. He wanted communism, and just because Russia wasn't ready for communism doesn't mean that they can't have it. The economy in Russia was still mostly farming at this time, so essentially Lenin revised the ideas of Karl Marx to fit the situation in agrarian Russia. But when the Bolsheviks came to power, their message had a lot of support. Basically, their message was to get Russia out of the war, give workers control of the factories, give non-Russian peoples their own states, and bring an end to the provisional government. So, the provisional government that came to power in 1917, after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas Romanov II, fell in late October to the Bolsheviks. This led to a 3-year civil war between the Bolsheviks and all sorts of people in Russia who weren't happy that the Bolsheviks were in power. So this included people that were loyal to the Romanovs, landlords who lost their land, more moderate reform groups who didn't want communism, but also armies from the United States and France and Japan who all didn't like the idea of Russia becoming a communist country. But Lenin and the Bolsheviks were stubborn. They hung to power. During the Civil War, they managed to sign a peace treaty with Germany in 1918 to pull Russia from the war. With that peace treaty, Russia had to give up territory to the Germans, but it was a price that they seemed willing to pay. And for the next 25 years, the Soviet Union, or Russia, stayed a communist country, but it was really a communist island surrounded by capitalist powers. It isn't until the second half of the 20th century that communism really takes off around the world.